Yeah, talking about that, where do you see upgrades of cochlear implants affecting, or how do you see them affecting people over the next few years as technology keeps improving and we keep throwing more and more transistors in a small space, more capabilities being achieved? I mean, it's not just something you can quickly upgrade. How would you, or how do you see that future playing out?
Well, there are three ways you can upgrade a cochlear implant. So the first way is simply by uploading new software into the processor. So if you open up the battery case and look here, you can see that there's an electronic interface. So the audiologist can actually connect a plug to this and upload new software into this device. So for example, when this device was first activated, or rather when my left ear was first activated, the software I had gave me 8 channels of auditory information. So basically what I did was I took all the sounds of the world and divided them up into 8 frequency bands. So I took all the lowest pitch sounds, directed them to 2 particular electrodes. So the next higher pitch sounds, sent them to 2 electrodes. So it chopped up the world to 8 frequency bands. You know, by comparison, your ear hears thousands of frequency bands. So it's a very dramatic reduction of the frequency resolution of the ear. Anyway, so I started out with 8 channels. But a year later, I got new software uploaded into this that gave me 16 channels. And 2 or 3 years after that, I got software that gave me the equivalent of 191 channels. So I've gotten new software several times, and that's been an upgrade each time. So that's one way of upgrading, just software alone. The second way is to replace the processor. So this is actually my third processor. So my first processor was actually a box about that big that I wore in my belt. And there's a wire that went underneath my shirt up to a headpiece on my ear. So the technology couldn't be miniaturized to be this small. So that was my first processor. The second processor was behind the ear processor, but it didn't have all the features that this one did. And I got this one about 5 years ago. So, you know, new processors come out every couple of years. So that's the second way you upgrade. The third way, which is very rarely done, is to remove a device, surgically remove it, and replace it with a new cochlear implant. That is almost never done for just the purpose of upgrading the implant itself, because the surgical risk of removing a device outweighs the potential gain of putting in a new implant. But in the rare number of cases where an implant fails, the old device will be removed and a new one, and often a more technologically advanced one, will be put in. And that's a kind of upgrade. So it's not impossible that in 5 years, 10 or 15 years, I might choose to upgrade a functioning implant with a new and completely different technology. But it's completely unknown whether I could do that now.
And how would you characterize each time you received an upgrade? You said you started at 8 channels, now you went to 16, then you went to over 100. How would you characterize those upgrades each time you received them?
Well, things sounded different each time. And so it was almost like going back to 0. Things sounded weird and bizarre. So when I went to from 8 channels to 16 channels, it basically doubled my frequency resolution. So I was hearing the differences between frequencies that before had sounded the same to me. And I had to learn how to hear those differences.
Even just in human communication?
Not so much in speech. That's the interesting part. So speech is actually pretty restricted in the number of frequencies that the human voice has. So a normal ear will hear anywhere between 50 cycles per second and about 12 to 16,000 cycles per second. But human speech only takes up the range between about 500 cycles per second and 4,000 cycles per second.
Okay.
So the implant software focuses on that relatively restricted range. It turns out that you can strip almost all the frequency variation of speech and still get very understandable speech. That's why even with only 8 channels, I can use the telephone. But when that was doubled to 16 channels, I was able to hear differences that I hadn't heard before. And it made speech sound different. So, you know, like my mother's voice on the telephone, it sounded so different that I had to hold the phone away from me and look at it to make sure that I was actually dialing her number. Okay? So her voice sounded so different. And then when I upgraded again to 191 channels, again, things sounded very different. So voices would, you know, their timbre changed. My sense of their pitch would change. So some voices would sound more high-pitched, others would sound more low-pitched. Music would sound different. So it was very much a learning process each time around.
Right.
Yeah, I also, from your book, you mentioned how one of the first things that you really realized was also that when you lose your hearing, you lose other things as well, including like your balance and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as much as the cochlear implant helps you with your hearing, has there been other things that cochlear implant doesn't cure?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, for about 3 years, I had diminished balance function after I went deaf. And that had nothing to do with getting the cochlear implant. Getting the implant itself made no difference. But I was a little bit dizzy for about 3 years. And I think my ear was just adapting to basically being electrified. But that's gone away. So since then, my balance has felt normal. So cochlear implants don't really change balance for the better or for the worse in most recipients. There are some exceptions. You know, cochlear implant, it's a technology with remarkably few, if any, undesirable side effects. Basically, you plug it in, it gives the brain electrical stimulation, the brain learns to interpret it as hearing. In very rare cases, the device will fail, or there may be an infection which forces the surgeon to remove the device, maybe put in a different one later on. But there are really no harmful side effects in normal implantation.
Yeah. Well, I have one final question then. We've talked a lot about how the intersection of computing and the human body. Where do you see the future of this going?
Well, there's kind of a garden of forking paths here. So it's very striking. I mean, look at these two devices here. So the device I got in 2001, that's the device I got in 2008. The electronics are identical. The number of transistors is exactly the same. The only thing that is different is the external casing. So there has been improvement in a lot of the details of cochlear implants, better processors, better software, but the fundamental technology has really not changed that much in the last 10 or 12 years. And the conversations I've had with engineers, I get the sense that there's a kind of a frustration in the field that they're not really able to reproduce the dramatic advances that made in cochlear implants in the 1980s and the 1990s. So it may be that you've come to the limits of what you can do with electricity in a cochlear implant. So there's been a lot of discussion of trying to come up with an entirely new technology that uses light to stimulate the cochlea, an optical cochlear implant. This is still very early kind of lab testing stages and using infrared light, which can actually stimulate nerve endings under some circumstances. Another possibility is genetically modifying the neurons in the cochlea so that they will respond, they will fire when they see different frequencies of light. That's an even more exotic technology. And these open up the possibility of creating cochlear implants that will give much better frequency resolution than the current generation of electrically designed cochlear implants. These are all distant possibilities. Even more distant is the idea of hair cell regeneration, where rather than creating these prosthetics that work around the damage, we'd actually cure deafness by regrowing the structures in the inner ear that are damaged in most cases of deafness. And again, this is still purely lab research. A lot of very fundamental nitty-gritty research going on into what the exact biology and physiology is of the hair cells, what exactly causes deafness, and how it might be possible to regrow them. So we know, for example, in birds, when birds experience damage to their inner ear, the inner ear will regrow. There's no such thing as a permanently deaf bird. So it's a really interesting question. If we can figure out how birds do that, maybe we can figure out how to do the same with human beings. It's funny, the joke in that field is success has always been 20 years off. Okay? So 10 years ago, people were saying, well, in 20 years we may get somewhere. Today, people are saying the exact same thing. So it's almost like a goal that seems to recede the more that we know. But there is a non-zero possibility, that when I'm in my 50s or 60s, it may be possible to actually cure the damage. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that I would automatically be a normally hearing person again, because my brain would not have grown up to distinguish all those different frequencies. So even giving me biologically perfect hearing might not necessarily mean that my brain would be able to interpret it. I would probably learn how to use that capacity over time, but it would be a protracted learning process.